let's review. Paul understood where his culture was coming from. He approached them in a non-judgmental manner. But how did his presentation go? How did he work with that? Well, we find that Paul used terms and references that they already knew. Even from the very outset of his message, he used an image that they saw every day. Idols to unknown gods were all over Athens. And there are a couple of different reasons for their existence. The first one is possibly that an altar was damaged and the original inscription was somehow erased. Second option is that it was a religious catch-all. The Greeks were so afraid of inadvertently angering any of the capricious gods by leaving them out of the pantheon that they literally chose an all of the above solution to their dilemma. But what Paul saw was that he chose to use this as an opportunity. He wasn't saying that the Greeks were worshiping Yahweh without really knowing it. That would be heresy. Instead, what he was doing was capitalizing on their own understanding that they didn't know necessarily everything that was out there. And what he told them was, let me tell you what you don't know. So, in addition to using images that they were familiar with, he also picked up on their literature. Now, actually, some biblical scholars fault Paul for not bringing any Hebrew scripture into his presentation. But we can see this as part of his strategy and as an indictment of the Jews who were in Athens. Athens has a synagogue, or had a synagogue. It's mentioned in verse 17. But as Paul is going through the marketplace, he realizes that these Greeks have no knowledge of Jewish scripture. And so it basically shows that the Jews weren't doing their job. So had he started off his presentation with, say, the Christological implications of Hebraic eschatology, they would have looked at him like he had 3 heads. So instead, he starts from square one and goes to what they know. So the first example of what he, there we go. The first example that he uses is, in him we live and move and have our being. Now, this actually is honoring Zeus by saying that he lives forever and that he's the source of all life. The second, for we are indeed his offspring, also is honoring Zeus by saying that all of life is connected to him. Now, while the Greeks normally understood this as honoring Zeus as the supreme god, Paul was able to recontextualize it and show them that even their own scripture is pointing to the one true God. So, okay, so at this point, let's step back into our own culture. What kinds of, what kinds of symbols in our culture do we know of that we can use to point people to Christ? In this case, the media is key for this idea. It's the language of our modern culture. So how can we use it? How can we harness its power? At the same time, though, what we need to realize is we have to understand it. Because there's nothing quite so awkward as someone trying to speak a language that they don't know. Take, for example, now some of you are not going to get this joke, and that's okay. What I'm using it for is to show you that there's a whole world of language and communication that we may or may not know. So, let's get back to Paul. We can see that he understood where his counterparts were coming from. He was open-minded in his approach, and he couched his presentation in Greek-friendly terms. But what about his content? Did that suffer because he was spending so much time and effort trying to help his counterparts understand? No. What we find is that he was doing the due diligence, even though he was using the terms that he knew that they'd understand. Basically, Paul gave them a simple yet complete message. Now, he did this by asking 3 simple questions. The first, where did we come from? This is actually, he spends the majority of his sermon just answering this question because he knows it's fundamental. Because without an accurate sense of where we come from, we won't know who we are or where we're going, or what we're doing, sorry. And he shows them that we were created by God, by his will, under his, through his power and under his control. So because of that, he's able to move on to a second question. Why are we here? This speaks to our purpose as human beings. I know that all of us have thought about this before. And consider Paul's audience. He's speaking with philosophers. They think about this every day. So what he answers them, though, is that rather than the pursuit of pleasure or the fulfillment of duty like they think, our actual purpose is to find God. And he's closer than most of them really think. So he moves on to his third question. What's going to happen to us? Well, since God is close and he's revealed himself in such a way that everyone can know him, we're without excuse for not turning from our old ways and seeking him. And in addition, he's going to send his son to judge us. So we better be ready. Now, Paul anticipates their disbelief at this point, so he proves his claim by showing them that God has given his son authority by raising him from the dead. Now, even though Paul adjusted his terms to meet the needs of his audience, he didn't back down from giving them the full force of the gospel. Even though he was dealing with the most learned men from one of the most philosophically sophisticated cultures in the known world, he didn't back down from telling them that they were ignorant. Basically, he showed them that they didn't know everything, and they were going to be held accountable for it. So, by using their own lines of logic, he was able to show them that their idolatry and their current way of thinking didn't make sense. So, instead, he boldly proclaimed the resurrection, even though he knew that his listeners would balk. He wasn't afraid of rejection. His call to present the good news of the gospel compelled him to give them the whole story. And he met with the reaction that he was expecting. Some outright sneered, some gave him the polite brush off, but then there were some who stuck with him and became believers. In fact, one of those men, Dionysius, eventually became the first bishop of Athens. So let's get back to ourselves. We find that we have a few questions to ask. Are we using both sides of the communication coin? Are we making sure that our presentations are clear, or are we getting bogged down in Christianese? At the same time, are we making an effort to give our listeners a full explanation of the gospel? Or are we watering it down so it'll be easier to take? Either of these reveals laziness on our part. Because if we think about it, if these people meant enough to Jesus that he would come and die for them, shouldn't they mean enough to us that we make sure that we're presenting a full picture of the gospel in a way that they'll understand?